Welcome and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And we're in Parshat Re'eh this coming week's Sedra. We are starting to get into specifics of mitzvot right now, and we're moving from the laws regarding sacrifices to laws regarding meat and how it is to be consumed, under what conditions. And we move from sacrificial meat to what is called chulin, non-sacrificial, non-holy, non-sacred meat. We move on to that. And then, by the way, of course, by way of context, this particular parsha repeats the laws of kashrut as to what animals are permissible and what animals are not permissible, and also the idea that in order to consume meat, it needs to be properly slaughtered, that we're not allowed to eat meat that dies of natural causes, whether the animal died naturally or the animal died through an accident or through being attacked by another animal. And by the way, the word treif, which many of you may know, it's a Yiddish word, treif, is from the Hebrew word taraf, which means torn. So an animal that has been attacked or killed by another animal or some animal like some way like that, as opposed to sort of naturally coming to the end of its life, would be considered treif. A carcass of an animal is called a nevela. That's the word. And it has an idea, nabol tibol, is an expression that we see elsewhere, which means to sort of reject or to hold it abhorrent. So the idea of eating meat that died in a way that was not slaughtered properly is also a biblical law, although the specifics of how animals are to be slaughtered is not to be found in the Torah itself. It's considered halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Many of these laws of how the animal is actually slaughtered are considered to be part of a tradition that goes back to Moses. That's what that literally means. In other words, very ancient traditions that were not written down in the Torah, but are nevertheless considered deoraita. They're still considered to be biblical in nature. So let's go on to this, right? So just back one sentence to like a look at this, right? It's saying essentially, Ki im b'makom asher yivchar Hashem ba'achad shvatecha. This is referring to essentially the temple ultimately, and that's where Sham ta'aseh kol asher Anochi mitzaveka. There you shall do all that I should command you. So that you, of course, understand now refers to statutory offerings. Just to review that, right? You could not bring statutory offerings on a bama. You had to bring it to the shrine. There were shrines up until the temple was built. But the bamot were permissible during that period of time. Once the temple was built, those shrines were no longer permissible. Now, going on. So this is referring to those. Rak b'chol avat nafshecha tizbach. So this word rak means only. So there's some limitation that's imposed by this word rak. B'chol avat nafshecha means basically according to all your heart desires, right? Your soul. Tizbach, you shall slaughter. Ba'achalta basar, and you shall consume, right? Meat. Kevirkat Hashem Elohecha, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, Asher Natan Lacha, who has given to you Bechol Sharecha, in all your gates. So this is not just in a shrine, right? This is, but we're going to see exactly what he's talking about here. Hatameh v'hatahor, whether you're in a state of purity or in a state of impurity, yochlenu, you can eat of it. Remember, when it came to sacrificial meat, you had to be in a state of purity if it was a sacrifice which you were permitted or commanded to eat. part of it, you had to be in a state of purity. But here we're talking about meat that you don't have to be in that particular state. You can see we are moving on to the eating, the consumption of meat itself. But it's still a transitional sentence, as you will see. Katzvi, like the deer, ayal, and like I believe ayal is a ram. Shirabeth, correct me, or Lauren, if you've got a different
Well, mine says gazelle, but I've heard
okay.
ayal to mean ram in the past.
Yeah, actually, you know something? But the point, I think gazelle, I like gazelle, and I'll tell you why. Because they're talking about kosher animals that are not brought on the altar. That's the point. Okay. So I don't want to say ram because sheep were brought on the altar. So thank you for that clarification. All right, let's go now. Let's get into the Rashi here. So the Rashi's got some splaining to do. Rak b'chol avat nafshecha, right? So rak only in all that your heart desires, something like that. Bameh hakatuv medaber. What is the scripture referring to? Im bebasar ta'ava lahatira lahem. If it's talking about an essentially meat that we have an appetite for, in other words, non-sacrificial meat, lahatira lahem belo hakravat imurim. If it's there that it's permissible to them without having to bring up imurim, remember, are those parts of the sacrifice that are offered up on the altar, right? It involved certain fat parts of the animal and the blood, etc. Hare hu amur b'makom acher. The fact is, this is stated, this kind of offering, which doesn't involve any sacrificial act whatsoever, other than the proper shechita, right? It is stated in another place. So in other words, when you go to the kosher butcher and you buy the meat from there, none of that meat was ever offered up. No parts of that animal were offered up on an altar. And in fact, you couldn't. There's no altar in which you could offer it up because there's no temple anymore. And since the temple was, remember, once the temple came into existence, there could be no more Bamot, and now we don't have a temple. So it's not talking about the meat that you go and buy at a kosher butcher, right? And it says Rashi's giving you in the place where this particular law of chulin meat, non-sacrificial meat, is mentioned, where it's simply a matter of your wanting to have a good steak or a good brisket or something like that. It says, Ki archiv Hashem Elokecha et kvucha, when the Lord your God enlarges your borders, bagomer, etc. Going on with this verse, amarta ochla basar, and you think to yourself, I'd love to eat some meat. I want to consume some meat, etc. Okay, so what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? But kodshim, here we are. We're talking about kodshim, meaning sacrificial meat, sanctified meat. Shenafal bahem bum, that incurred a blemish. So in other words, you can't now offer up this animal as a sacrifice anymore. Sheyipadu, that it needs to be redeemed. In other words, you redeem the animal by paying the price of the animal, probably plus an added fourth, something like that. But you redeem the animal. So in that case, where the animal was originally designated as a sacrificial animal, but some blemish occurred to it, which it no longer could, so it could no longer be brought up onto the altar. The mitzvah is to redeem that animal. And they can now eat that redeemed animal in any place they like, right? So he goes on to define this, because now we're actually talking about stuff that would involve oral Torah, meaning we are talking now about the application of Torah with circumstances and realities, etc. Right? Right. Yachol yifdu al mum over. Can you now what kind of blemish are we talking about is what he's saying. Can they redeem it if it is a transient blemish, meaning something possibly like a wart that can be removed, as opposed to a broken bone or something like that? So is it something? Talmud lomar rak. So this is where that word rak, meaning only, is a limitation. Remember, I told you the word rak limits the application of this particular law. So this law that if a blemish occurs to an animal that has been designated for a sacrifice occurs, you are to redeem it, and then you can eat the animal wherever you like, okay? But it has to do with a blemish. In other words, it isn't just any blemish. It cannot be a transient blemish. Do you want me to pause a moment? I don't see any hands raised. I'm assuming then that you understand what I just said, or do you need any clarification? I'm going to continue. All right. I'm assuming you understood what I just said. So you see what I mean by this sort of technical way in which this verse is applied. Tizbach v'achalta. You shall sacrifice, slaughter, and consume. And this is a reference to the tractate Bechorot, Yevamot, etc. These are Talmudic tractates. So, so what it's saying is, again, this is limited. It's saying you do not have a right, heter giza, which means to shear, v'chalev. Okay, that's why this is pointed there, because chalev would be the fat of the animal. You don't have the permission to shear, to take the wool of this animal or its fat. Ela achila. You only are allowed to consume it. Al yedei zvicha, and this, so zvicha is some kind of proper slaughtering. Lauren, do you have anything to add to this in your translation?
Well, only that mine says instead of to take the fat, and I understand where you're coming from, but mine says to milk it.
I know, but it says chalev, and
Well, I mean, it seems to be related to the word that means
no,
could be.
I
Go ahead.
know. Yeah, so that's right. It makes more sense. Your translation makes more sense. First of all, you're not allowed to, the only kind of fat that you're allowed to eat, is part of like the meat, that's like the marbling in meat. So either I'm mistranslating the chalev, okay, and maybe that's it. So, but
Well, chalev though, but milk is fat.
it is, but that's why it's called chalav. But it is chalav, okay?
Yeah.
So,
So,
if it had said, if it had been pointed, you can see the pointing here, right? It's got two A sounds, two tseres here. So that's why I translated the way I did, but I'm sure that it means the milk, because clearly, if it was it was a goat or a cow, these are things which we use the milk of.
but they may have used the word fat, meaning the milk, which is fat of the cat, the fat of the
Yes,
cow that you don't
right,
take.
right. But it
So
would have, but had it said the chalav, it would have been unambiguous.
true. And as far as the slaughter thing, it just
Yes.
says, in mine it just says ritual slaughter.
Okay, okay. So ritual slaughter usually means, shechting. What
I
we,
know, and it's interesting that they're using a
yes,
different word than
right,
lishchot.
right. It doesn't say shchita. So, I again, this animal became defective. Of course, it would depend on when it became defective. But if it became defective after you began the process, again, even though it's been designated for the altar, it can no longer be brought up. At any rate, we understand now that while the animal becomes permissible for personal consumption, it's only for eating the meat. You don't have a right to milk this animal. You don't have a right to shear this animal, because remember, we want to retain some level of sanctity to this animal. Okay, going on. Thank you. Hatameh v'hatahor, the pure and the impure, lefi sheba'u mikoach kodshim. He says we need the Torah to tell us this, is that since the permissibility to consume this animal came from nevertheless from an animal that was designated as a sanctified animal, right? Shene'emar bahem, and because regarding sanctified animals, regarding kodshim, it states regarding them in Leviticus 7, v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tameh. It says in that case, any flesh of the animal which comes into contact with something that is impure, lo, I think it's ye'achel, cannot be consumed. So what if a person is impure, right? That's also an impurity. So and it has to do with sanctified meat. The text has to explicitly make it permissible. That both a pure person and an impure person can consume from one dish. Ketzvi v'cha'ayal. So he says, like a deer and like a gazelle. And I'm going to write that in. I'm going to actually write that in because it's helpful. Let me make sure. Oops, sorry, just 1 second. See if I can get this. 1 second. Yep, there it is. Thank you. Forgive me for a moment. So I want to put in gazelle. And I want to put in here, sorry, do that here. And I want to put in milk here so that next time I see it, I won't forget. And we know. All right. Right. So ketzvi v'cha'ayal, like a stag or a gazelle, she'en korban ba'amehem. It's saying it's like these animals which are not offered up as a sacrifice. Literally, it means a korban, a sacrifice, is not brought from these species. Going on, ketzvi v'cha'ayal, like a stag or like a gazelle, Lefatran mit min zroa v'halachayim v'hakeva. So what it's saying is that this particular designated animal that was originally supposed to be brought on the altar, developed a blemish, now can be eaten basically as chulin meat, okay, that nevertheless it's totally like it's not like regular meat or regular like animals that are brought on the altar like cows, sheep, and goats. It's more like these animals, like a stag and a gazelle. And what it does is it exempts them, lefatram. In other words, these animals that we're talking about regarding the ones that developed a blemish, they are exempt min hazroa, from the literally zroa means the leg, the foreleg, v'halachayim, the cheeks, v'hakeva, and the maw. All right. Now, my understanding is that when it came to the regular animals that were slaughtered for personal consumption, you had to still give part of it to the priest. I could be wrong about it. I did check this to see, but it appeared to me as if in a regular animal that's eaten non-sacrificial, although I know for a fact that it makes more sense to me. I'm saying this because what I understood from what Safaria, when I did my research with Safaria, but I do happen to know that when it came to parts of the animal, if you brought a sacrifice, and it was the kind of sacrifice like a todah or shlamim, where part went on the altar, part went to the priest, and part went to the family, this is the part that would go to the priest, which is the zroa and the cheek, the foreleg and the cheek, and the maw, right? The keva, I believe, is the intestines. What can I say? I know they make.
Well, I just looked up maw.
Yes.
It said like jaws and throat.
Oh, really?
And also, so my mindset translates, instead of cheek, it translates as jaws.
Yeah.
But if the maw is a jaw or the jaw and the throat, I don't know. But I guess it just means this area.
Well, I'm happy for Shira Beth to chime in here, but when I was a child learning daily Hebrew, okay, I can tell you that a nice way to say move your bowels, go to the bathroom, is lahapil et hakeva. Okay, that's the way one says it, as euphemistically or politely in Hebrew. So keva I always understood to mean your intestines. So
Yeah, I think that's how it's used in modern Hebrew, but my translation also says the two cheeks and the maw.
I'm going to look up. I would question the translation of more. I always thought more, and
It's
in
not a
other places,
translation, it's a definition.
yeah, I know. No, I understand. I'm surprised at the
The
definition.
jaws of a voracious animal, the mouth or gullet of a greedy person.
Oh, you know something? It is an old English verb. Yes, I think it is an old English word for mouth or something like that. But I'm telling you that I think more also means innards.
I've read it in stories about dragons, the dragon's maw.
Yeah.
So I'm
As the
looking it up etymologically, and it's referring now to stomach.
There we go.
It says
Right.
Middle English mao from Old English maga, maga,
Yeah.
stomach
Yeah.
of men and animals, including fish and birds. Modern English,
Innards. Innards.
yeah,
Yeah. That's the way I always
bag
understood
or
it.
stomach.
Yes. Right.
It's
Okay.
related to a word that means like bellows or leather bag. The meaning of throat and gullet came later.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So there's some, and forgive me, so I'm still wrong if I were to translate it as intestines. It's more the stomach than the intestines. But the thing is keva, I'm telling you, in Hebrew, I understand I would translate that as innards.
So a maw worm is an intestinal worm
Yes.
in
Yes.
in the year in from coming from the year 1600. So
Uh-huh.
it's euphemistic. So
Right. Okay, well, it's good that we're discussing it and trying to clarify it. The point is that these were gifts when you brought a sacrifice that the family consumed as well, like a shlamim offering. These are the parts that were designated for the priests. And I think that makes much more sense. In other words, I'm going to have to disagree with my understanding of Sepharia here. But I could be wrong, and it could in fact be that it refers even to regular chulin meat. But I know for
so
a fact that it's saying here, what makes sense is that since this was an animal that was originally designated for the altar, and you would have eaten it, okay, this animal, that part of that animal might still have gone. You might have thought, well, since it was a sacrifice, part of it would still go to the priest, right? Those designated parts. But the fact is that it doesn't. That's what it's saying.
yeah, mine says in parentheses after the foreleg, the jaws, and the maw, it says just as the deer and the gazelle are exempt from those gifts to the Kohen, and
Right.
it says that's from Hulin 130a C frame.
So the point is, though, the fact that it's in Chulin, right, that tractate called Chulin, would seem to indicate that maybe it refers to the regular meat that we eat. But I'm
But I mean, just because if it's in something about regular meat doesn't mean it can't also talk about sacrificial meat. I mean,
well, the point is
stuff
it
goes.
okay. So the point is, if it applies to regular meat, then for sure it would apply to sacrificial meat. But if I'm not mistaken, you could go to a kosher butcher and get the foreleg of a lamb and consume it, right? That they sell the foreleg of a lamb, and it's not considered to be designated for, that can't be eaten, even though we don't give it to priests, to be eaten in purity anymore because we don't have a sacrificial system. Let's go do a little bit more. I hope this has been relatively clear and interesting to you. Rak hadam. So again, look at this. Again, we've got a limitation, a word that's a limiting word. However, hadam, blood, the blood, lo tochelu, you shall not consume the blood. In other words, makes sense because it's saying what you can consume. That's sort of an exceptional case, but it's saying the blood isn't an exceptional case. Ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim, you shall pour it out on the earth like water. So again, we need to read this here. Rak hadam lo tochelu, however, you shall not consume the blood. Af al pi she'amarti, Rashi is, interpolating here. Even though I, this is God, of course, amarti, I have said, she'ein lecha bo zrikat dam b'mizbeach, because this animal originally would have been designated for the altar, but it developed a blemish. Even though I said that you do not have, in this animal, there is no throwing of the blood on the altar, you know already that was part of the blood work of an offering, of a sacrifice. So, but it developed a blemish. So you can't take the blood of this blemished animal and dash it against the sides of the altar. You don't do that. Lo tochlenu, however, you still cannot consume it, even though it is not designated for the altar. Tishbachenu kamayim, you shall pour it out like water. Lomar lacha, right? This is to tell you, she'ein sarich kisui, that it doesn't need to be covered. So there is elsewhere in the Torah, there is a mitzvah to take the blood and to cover it up, to cover up the blood. And this is done with blood that is taken. Now, I am almost certain, and I could be, this is all coming from memory now, that with regards to the blood of a gazelle or a deer, it requires the blood to be actually covered up. Now, whether that applies to regular animals that we do normally consume, such as the animals that are brought on the altar, I'm not sure. But it would make sense for it to tell you that nevertheless, unlike the deer and the gazelle, it doesn't require to be covered up. It can be poured out like water. Okay, so here we go. Davar acher harehu kamayim. So again, what they're doing is they are deriving every element. They're sort of wringing out with a W, right? Wringing out every possible meaning of these words, right? So he says another interpretation is harehu kamayim. Judith, I see you. Give me 2 seconds here. It is like water. Lahachshir et hazraim. In other words, this blood, you need to know a little something here, that for seeds, zraim, right, plants or seeds, in order for them to be able to become tameh, to develop impurity, they have to be wet. And normally, of course, when we think about wetting something, we think about water. However, there are several types of liquids that actually can also render. In other words, when the seeds come in contact with these particular liquids, they now are susceptible to tuma. They're susceptible to impurity, and one of those liquids is blood. By comparing blood to water, by saying pouring it out like water, there is a scriptural basis for considering blood to also, and lahachshir means, normally, of course, it means make it fit for consumption, but here it just simply means it now makes it fit, i.e. susceptible for tum'ah. That's what we're talking about, is hechsher tum'ah. Judith, your question or point.
Question and, off topic or from it.
Okay.
You were talking about gazelles.
Yes.
And I have seen twice Torah scrolls that were written on deer skin.
Mm.
And so if there's they aren't, let's say, gazelles wouldn't normally be brought because you have to be able to hold on to it to do a kosher slaughter.
Yes.
And do you think that could be how they get deer skin to write a Torah scroll?
It is, unfortunately, that is beyond the scope of my knowledge. My understanding is that the Torah scroll, of course, has to be written on the skin of a kosher animal. But I would say that conceptually, it's possible for them to capture a gazelle and then to properly slaughter it. Now, whether deer and gazelle requires the same level of shechita that the domesticated animals require, this is now going beyond my pay grade. All right, I would have to do the research on that to find out if, in fact, that is the case. But I wouldn't think that we're talking about, I wouldn't think, right? I could be wrong, wouldn't think that we're talking about a deer or gazelle that was shot. Okay, but I would have to check.
Well, I can't imagine that it could, that could be, because,
Right.
yeah, okay.
But I'm comfortable with the fact that the deer and the gazelle, because it's an ungulate and because it has cloven hoofs, is a kosher animal. Okay.
They have farms for those now. You
Yes.
can, there's deer and gazelle farms that, they're kept relatively domestic, so
No, that would be
I,
considered, that would be considered sufficient. You know that when it comes to birds, right? When it comes to fowl, it has to be domesticated to be kosher. That is to say that even if it is so, wild turkeys cannot be kosher, even if they're slaughtered properly. There is that limitation. So whether that applies to wild gazelle, etc., I don't know. Again, there's just so much to learn, right? There's just so many details when it comes to the application of this divine law, which is, I think, in itself very cool. I'm going to stop the share. And if there are any other comments at this point before I stop the recording? Okay, I'll stop the recording.